Good morning. I'm Joe Molinaro with the National Association of Realtors, and it's a real pleasure to be here at the Complete Community Summit. I took part in last year's summit, which was excellent, and I was very happy when the Delaware Association of Realtors contacted me and wanted to partner again on supporting this event. And I commend the realtors in Delaware for the relationships they developed with all the other sponsors of today's summit. I've been asked to spend a minute or two talking about the realtors' involvement in complete communities and smart growth. At NAR, I'm the manager of a program that we call the Smart Growth Program, and we provide technical assistance and small grants to realtor associations so they can become leaders in their communities on helping their communities grow better. We also publish this magazine, On Common Ground, and I hope you pick up a copy today. We also undertake public opinion polling, and you'll hear later today from the other speaker from NAR some results of a poll we just released on Friday called our Community Preference Survey. Our Smart Growth Program was begun in 2000, but right now I see an even greater urgency for realtors to be involved in this issue. Realtors' livelihood depends on a healthy economy and a healthy real estate market. And I believe we're now seeing a major shift in consumer attitudes and preferences, and that states and localities need to respond to this shift if they're going to remain economically competitive. I think that some of the challenges we continue to face in the real estate field now are not just a hangover from the recession, but are a problem of the market no longer providing what a lot of people want today. Realtors in Delaware are recognizing that we're in a very challenging environment and are looking for ways to meet this new demand and to change the regulations that need to be changed so we can build to meet tomorrow's demand. And I just want to again commend Delaware Realtors for being part of this partnership as the private sector and the public sector work together to build a better future for Delaware. And it's also my pleasure, I've been given the nice assignment of introducing our first keynote speaker today. So I'm happy to introduce to you Jonathan Levine. He is on the faculty of the Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. His research centers on policy reform in transportation and land use. He's the author of Zoned Out: Regulation, Markets, and Choices in Transportation and Metropolitan Land Use. In Zoned Out, Professor Levine argues against the view that sprawl is the result of market forces, but rather that sprawl has been embedded in our regulatory system for decades. And he makes the point that our attempts to reform land use policy should be geared toward increasing consumer choice. His current work focuses on the transformation of the transportation and land use planning paradigm from one of mobility to one of accessibility. His research has been supported by the Federal Highway Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Michigan Department of Transportation, among other agencies and institutions. His work has won many awards. The one that caught my eye on his resume the most was a residential fellowship in 2011 at the Rockefeller Foundation Center in Bellagio, Italy. I guess that falls under tough duty with somebody who has it. Among his several degrees is a Ph.D. in City and Regional Planning from the University of California, Berkeley. So please help me welcome Jonathan Levine.
Joe, thanks very much for that nice introduction. Thanks to Ted Patterson and the Institute for Public Administration at the University of Delaware for this great invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. That's where we are. So I'd like to start with a visit to the suburbs of anywhere, USA. I suppose I could do a little Q&A guessing game, suburbs of where, but it would take a long time because I think it looks pretty familiar to all of you from lots and lots of places. Happens to be Fruit Heights, Utah, a suburb of Salt Lake City. And if you were to be driving around this suburb, you might ask yourself, what do you think of this environment? And what you think of this environment probably has a lot to do with what you think about complete communities, what you think about markets, and what you think about planning and planning intervention. So some people looking at this environment might say, you know, here's an example of the market at work. Americans like large houses, Americans like land use separations, Americans like an auto-oriented physical environment, and by golly, here the market does a good job of providing Americans with what they want. After all, it's the American dream, isn't it? Others looking at this environment might say something as follows. You know, this is the market producing something that's turned out to be a problem for us. The market produces too much sprawl. The market produces too much auto-orientation. The market produces too little affordable housing. So what we really need as urban planners or policy administrators, what we need is governmental intervention into the market to bring about things that the market isn't interested in or isn't capable of bringing about on your own. So roughly I've tried to sketch what a pro-market view and a pro-planning view, and you've all heard echoes of those views and the clash between those views. Now I'd like to show you what you won't see if you are driving around Fruit Heights, Utah. What you won't see is what was originally proposed for that area. So the developer not the developer that ultimately built the neighborhood, another developer said, you know what I want to build here, not because I'm a do-gooder, not because I'm especially interested in affordable housing. I'm working with the developer's imperative. I've got to make profits. And this is my profit-maximizing solution for this area, a set of row houses that would have been just over half the cost of what was actually built. Well, I think you can see where the story is headed. The city of Fruit Heights, Utah said, no, that's not what we want here. We want large single-family homes. So this little story illustrates something about what our beliefs about markets and our beliefs about planning, and our assumption that the status quo represents a physical expression of people's preferences through the markets. You know, when I went to planning school back in the 80s, I was taught that the way we do things in the United States is we let markets run unless we can establish a market failure, externalities, public goods. Everybody who studied urban planning or public administration or economics, this is all familiar stuff. If we can establish that market failure, then we have the rationale for governmental intervention. So this framework of let the markets run unless we establish a market failure is kind of imprinted on many of us. It was certainly imprinted on me. But it doesn't allow for the reality that, wait a second, maybe policy reform doesn't amount to intervention into markets. Maybe intervention into markets is already ubiquitous. Maybe policy reform is actually creating some niches where markets can actually operate and serve people's interests more. It's a different way of looking at the transportation and land use or complete communities question. Now, maybe this story of Fruit Heights, Utah, maybe it's an isolated incident. Well, I can guarantee you it's not, and all of you who are involved in local planning, I suspect, recognize that this is a very, very common occurrence. Just to do a check to make sure that it's still right, I looked I looked at some newspaper databases. Sure enough, we've got from September 12th, just last couple months ago, from Charlotte, North Carolina, a very similar story. Just reading the bottom line, the village council sided with the majority of the speakers and rejected Meritage's request, leaving the land zoned for 1 house per acre. Just a little twist here. Note that the residents want low-density housing. That's the headline. And the choice was between one unit per acre and 1/2 unit per acre. And the residents said, we want low-density housing, therefore kept to 1 unit per acre. Or another recent example, just this past summer in Chicago, developer turns to county. The developer was turned down for changing zoning on a golf course to from single family to one that would allow apartments and townhouses. The developer was turned down, only single family for this golf course development. But again, let's take a look at the bottom line in the red type. It definitely showed the entire board is supporting the decision we made about a month ago to keep that open space. Developing as single family amounts to keeping that open space, whereas if we had allowed those townhouses and apartments, that would have been eliminating that open space. So this is the most common story in U.S. planning. There's a constant drumbeat of these. But I don't know if you've noticed, I've been doing a little bit of subliminal advertising here. I don't know if you notice the image that's in back of there. The image is an iceberg. Let's think about it. Logically, the stories that actually end in a turn down, end in a municipal council or a city council saying to a developer, no, we're not going to do that, have logically got to be the tip of the iceberg of potential denser than development or denser than their surroundings. Here's my reasoning. I love speaking with developers, the real estate industry, and the most common thing that I hear from developers is, you know what, we don't want to go where we're not wanted. We don't have time and we don't have money to fight a hostile population. If we're not wanted in a particular place, we're going to go somewhere else. Which is a very sensible position. So here are cases where there actually was a conflict that came to a head and ended up in a turn down and rejection of a proposal. But of course, those proposals are very expensive to develop and to bring to market. So the rational, self-interested developer is going to self-censor, and when he or she thinks that those proposals are going to get rejected, that person is just going to walk away, right? So logically, this constant drumbeat of stories that we see where local planning forces a lower development profile, lower density development profile than what developers wanted, that's got to be, my subliminal advertising here, the tip of the iceberg. So all of this raises questions that I'd like to consider today about the relationship between planning and governmental intervention and the market. We think we know what we're talking about when we say, let the market run, or planning should intervene into the market. And the more I look into it, the more I realize I don't know that I know what we're talking about, because I think planning and the market are so intertwined. And notably, policy interventions can be understood, or I'm going to argue that our policy reforms ought to be understood not as intervening into the market, something that presumably requires justification, right? That's why we look into all sorts of travel behavior benefits or physical activity benefits. We want to justify our interventions into the market. But wait a second. Maybe our policy reforms aren't interventions into the market. Maybe our policy reforms are opening up of the market, in which case, if they have travel behavior benefit, cool, icing on the cake. If they have physical activity benefit, well, we'd love to have that. But I don't think we need to look for scientific proof of those benefits, because ultimately what we're doing is opening up choice. We're expanding choice for people. We have a current regime that's been contracting choice. If what you want, of course, is a single-family home on a large lot in a land-use separated area, sure, you've got a lot of choice, but what about the large and growing segments of the population that I think we're going to hear from Joe later on that want to choose something else? Are we providing that kind of choice, or are we obstructing that kind of choice? So to provide a little framework, I'd like to depict what I think is the current terms of the debate, and then I'd like to see if we can shift the debate. So here's how I think we currently evaluate the question of complete communities. If we start at the bottom, we ask ourselves, well, what's the market for alternatives to urban sprawl? And we say, you know what, the market wants to sprawl. That's just what markets do. The reason why we need planning intervention, the reason why we need policy intervention, that's to intervene into those markets and incite them or induce them or force them to provide something that they're otherwise incapable of providing. That's the foundation of how I argue, we currently view the situation. When we reform policy, what do? Well, we intervene into markets. We take those markets that are currently free markets and we say, gosh, we really ought to change those free markets. We ought to intervene into those free markets. The third question is what would justify that policy reform? And what would justify that policy reform is proven benefits, as we talked about. Reduced driving, increased walking, better physical activity, reduced obesity, etc. So that's why we're busy, my colleagues around the country are busy doing scientific research, trying to see if we can establish those benefits. So don't take my word for it, though. I want to give a quote that really illustrates this current paradigm. This quote is from Jan Bruckner, urban economist, who asks the following. Does the invisible hand which guides the conversion of land to urban use push too hard in the direction of bigger cities? Economists use the term market failure to describe a situation in which the invisible hand fails to allocate resources in a socially desirable manner so as to maximize aggregate economic well-being. Is a market failure involved in the spatial expansion of cities? If so, the criticism of urban sprawl is justified, and measures are needed to restrict urban expansion. Okay, so Bruckner here is perfectly illustrating the framework that I put up before. So he's clearly in this current mainstream of how we think about land use planning. But let's think about this for a second. The fundamental premise of this reasoning: does the invisible hand push too hard in the direction of bigger cities? Well, if all you're looking for is the effect of Adam Smith's invisible hand, then you're not going to be very likely to find the effect of the very visible hand of land use regulations that keep development densities low, and keep land uses separated, and mandate large areas of parking, and mandate minimum lot sizes. You won't find those because all you're looking for is the invisible hand. So let me suggest an alternative way of thinking about land use and policy. Really, we're asking the same three questions. What's the market for alternatives to sprawl? And the answer is, well, there is a market in this second way of thinking about things, but municipal regulations is a binding constraint on that market. Municipal regulation limits the extent to which that market can be expressed. What is it that we're doing when we're reforming policy? Well, we're removing obstacles. We're removing obstacles to that market being expressed. What would justify that policy reform in this alternative universe, the second paradigm? It's really expansion of choice that would justify. I'll tell you a little story. A few years ago, I was preparing a survey of people's preferences for neighborhoods. What I was interested in is developing a scale of preferences from auto-oriented and low-density auto-oriented neighborhoods to higher-density walking and transit-oriented neighborhoods, and I assumed that people would have different preferences, and not everybody wants the same thing. So I walked around my own building at the University of Michigan, finding people to answer my survey just as kind of guinea pigs. One of the gentlemen that answered the survey answered, and he came off strongly in favor of walkable communities. And I did with him what I did with other people, and that is I asked him, after he filled out the survey, I asked him why he answered the way he did, how he perceived the questions, etc. So he patted his rather ample belly, and he said, well, Jonathan, I think it would be good for my health. I said, okay, great, that's a great reason to be interested in a walkable community. But then I got to thinking, what does the scientific literature say about the connection of walkability and obesity? You know, there's evidence for, and there's evidence against, and there's evidence that says it's ambiguous. So the question is, what shall the message be to this individual? So one possible message is, well, sorry, sir, the scientific evidence doesn't prove that smart growth is going to make you skinny. Therefore, we're going to continue to zone out smart growth. That's one possibility, right? The other possibility, which would be a much more sensible possibility, is we don't know if smart growth is going to make you skinny. We hope it is. And we want to give you the opportunity to test it because it ought to be up to you. You ought to have the freedom to choose a neighborhood like that. So we're going to attack obstacles to you getting what you want, regardless of if the scientific proof is conclusive or non-conclusive. Just for symmetry, let's add in a quote that very much embodies the second paradigm. And this is another economist, Anthony Downs, who writes, so the belief that sprawl is caused primarily by market failures is based on the false assumption that there is a freely operating land use market in the U.S. metropolitan areas. No metropolitan area has anything remotely approaching a free land use market because of local regulations adopted for parochial political, social, and fiscal purposes. Most suburban land use markets are dominated by local zoning and other regulations that are aimed at excluding low-income households that distort what would occur in a truly free market. Okay, two big competing paradigms, different ways of looking at the world and different ways of thinking about what we're doing. Those of us who are engaged in complete communities. What is it that we're doing? Are we intervening in markets because we can prove that there's a market failure going on? Or are we removing obstacles to people getting what they want? I'm going to argue for the latter, and I have. But just to review, let's talk about what the stakes are. If we start from that view that was imprinted on me in the 1980s, that we let the market run unless we can prove a market failure, what difference do these two frameworks make? Well, let's start from the assumption that proof of benefit of complete communities is ambiguous. Okay, so that's the story of, sir, we don't know if smart growth is going to make you skinny, but we think you ought to have a chance to choose it anyway. Or complete communities that can make you skinny, you ought to have a chance to choose it anyway. Let's assume that it's ambiguous. Let's run that assumption through framework number one. Framework number one views the status quo as the free market. What do we conclude from that if we start from the idea that we intervene when we have proven market failures? We would say there's no justification. We refrain from intervening into markets. So under framework number one, scientific ambiguity is construed as a basis for keeping the status quo, for not reforming policy. Does that make sense? Thank you, sir, for shaking your head. By contrast, if we run that assumption through framework number 2, the assumption of the relationship of markets and choice, markets and regulation, we would say, you know what? Even if the benefits are ambiguous, we ought to remove regulatory obstacles. People ought to be able to get more of what they want. So let's see if we can change this idea. Could I have some water? Oh, maybe I can. So let's take this kind of abstract diagram and put it into some real policy context. And for this, I'm going to go to the state of Oregon. Oregon has its very famous transportation planning rule, state legislation, which is a very long rule, but I want to read some operative language from the Oregon Transportation Planning Rule. Local governments shall adopt land use and subdivision regulations to reduce reliance on the automobile, which allow transit-oriented development on lands along transit routes. So first, let's do a little dissecting of this law. So here's the state of Oregon saying to the municipalities of Oregon, if you're along a transit route, you're required to allow transit-oriented development. Note that you're not required to require. It's a big difference between being required to allow and required to require. You're required to allow meaning, you know what, we gave you the land use, we delegated to you the land use planning authority to begin with. State can giveth, state can taketh away. And what we're doing is we're taking away your right to zone out transit-oriented developments along transit routes. Okay, you still have the land use authority, you can still regulate everything else. Just one thing you can't do is you can't keep out transit-oriented developments. So let's think about this. Let's think about this rule in light of these two paradigms. If we start from the framework of paradigm number 1, this rule amounts to the state of Oregon intervening into the land development market in Oregon. It's constraining what the local governments can do, therefore it's intervening into that market. And of course the natural question after that is, what would justify that intervention? What naturally follows from that are the libraries and libraries of scientific evidence for and against the very benefits of smart growth in complete communities. Do we need to accept the idea that this is an intervention into the market? Well, I argue no. Quite the opposite. This is a state law that's actually opening up the market by preventing exclusionary regulations. And if that's the case, then how we ought to think about it, how we ought to communicate it, and how we ought to provide a rationale for it shift entirely. But ultimately, the question amounts to something else. So many people will hear everything that I'm saying, and they'll say, you know what, you're assuming that land use regulation is a binding constraint, hence my little graphic here, is a binding constraint on development. So let's define what we mean by binding constraint. If the market ordinarily, without the uncontrolled market, would develop only up until this level, and land use regulation constrains it to a lower level, then the regulation constitutes a binding constraint. We're forcing a low-density development. By contrast, if the land use market would develop to this level, and that's what land use regulations allow anyway, then land use regulation is kind of like, it's a bit of window dressing. In other words, it's kind of putting an official seal on what the market is providing anyway. So there are these two views, the binding constraint versus the non-binding constraint view. Clearly, for this second paradigm to hold, one would have to show that the constraints are binding, that they're actually consequential, as opposed to, maybe what we're doing is we're rearranging a little bit where the single-family houses go and where the multifamily houses go, but that's all we're doing. We're not actually forcing a low-density development pattern. So I'd like to provide different ways of thinking about this question, some a little bit more formal, some a little bit more informal. The first is a visual way of thinking about this question. Here I'm showing a picture of a residential street in Sunnyvale, California. Now, here, Sunnyvale here is not representing the suburbs of anywhere. It's representing a very particular kind of suburb. So Sunnyvale is the absolute heart of Silicon Valley. From this neighborhood, you could, if there were complete streets, walk to Apple Computer. You wouldn't actually want to do it. You take your life in your hands, but in terms of sheer distance, that's the centrality of this neighborhood. This neighborhood developed in 1964, before the term Silicon Valley was even coined. The term was coined in 1970. And in the ensuing years, this neighborhood went from the sleepy, remote suburbs of the San Francisco Bay Area to the global heart of the telecommunications and computation industry. How has this neighborhood changed in the meantime? Well, the answer is not at all. It's precisely the same building style, or actually precisely the same buildings, and precisely the same single-family fabric as it was back in 1964 when it developed, notwithstanding the fact that this area underwent the most radical economic change that one could imagine. It became the leading economic zone of the world, if we think of the high-tech industry as the world's leading economic driver. How will it change in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years? My answer is not at all. These buildings will age. Some of them will be demolished. They'll be replaced by other single-family houses, maybe larger single-family houses. But what we do in the United States is we develop an area, and then we zone it, and that freezes its development form into place. And when I see this area, what I see are the tens of households or scores of households that could have lived in this area and had a very, very short commute, but don't, because of our land use regulatory approach. Just by way of contrast, I bring a city from Europe. This could be a lot of different places. It happens to be Salonika, Greece. And Salonika, Greece developed in this low-density fashion these small bungalows. As they, in the 1920s, and as they aged, they were knocked down and replaced by increasing development densities. And I asked myself, what would have happened if this were the United States? And the answer is, it would have been a single-family zone, and it would have been protected. And the urban change that is part of the ordinary course of urbanization throughout human history would have been thwarted. I'm not arguing that this is a good urban form or that it's a bad urban form, but I'm just arguing for what it is that we do when we regulate land uses in our American style. So that's quite informal way of thinking about things. I'd like to do a little bit more formal. This was a survey that I did several years ago about developer preferences. I asked this was members of the Urban Land Institute was my sample source, and I asked them a number of questions. And one of the questions I asked them is, let's say we were to relax land use regulation. How would that affect your product? Would your product be denser, less dense, or the same density? And I asked for your product when you're building in these various urban environments, center city, inner suburb, outer suburb, and rural. And then this is separated out, as you can see, by region. Let's just start by looking at the overall respondents, this blue line. So what we see is that, especially in those close-in suburban areas, developers want to build more densely than regulations allow. Here we have evidence. 80% of developers say, when I'm building in those close-in suburban areas, if you didn't regulate me, I would build more densely than regulations allow. So the idea somehow that policy reform in favor of density, in favor of mixed use, amounts to interventions in the market doesn't seem to be supported by this evidence. Quite the opposite. This seems to be evidence that, that our current regulations are binding constraints. The other thing that I know is how similar the pattern is in virtually every region of the country. My interpretation is as follows. There is interest in building higher density than current regulations allow in our cities, but the cities don't have the extent of anti-density regulations that the suburbs do, so there's a little bit more accommodation of density, hence the slightly lower numbers in the city. There's very little interest, of course, in building densely in rural areas. So very few of the developers say, yes, if you would unshackle me in the rural areas, I would build more densely. But in those inner suburbs, it's where we have the biggest tension between what developers are interested in doing, and more broadly we can say what the market wants, and what current residents seem to want, because the current residents keep on seeming to vote in city council people who enact regulations that protect their low-density environments. This was a piece of research that I did on the supply side. Now I want to switch to demand-side research. And this research was a study of Metro Boston and Metro Atlanta. And what was incorporated in this research was both the preferences of the individuals. Actually, this was the research that came from that study where I asked the gentleman, what kind of neighborhood would you want? And he wanted a neighborhood that would allow him to live a healthier lifestyle. This was a study of individuals' preferences and the characteristics of the neighborhood that the individuals lived in. So in other words, I was able to check the match between what people say they want and what they actually got. So let's look at the axes of these graphs. So the horizontal axis is preferences for higher density pedestrian and transit-oriented neighborhoods versus preferences for auto-oriented neighborhoods. And the vertical axis is the percent of the people living in pedestrian and transit friendly neighborhoods. So, as an example, if we take this number 1 here, this would be the top 10% of people in both Boston and Atlanta, and I pooled the two for doing this, so it's actually people who have identical preferences, as best as I could measure them in Boston and in Atlanta, the top 10% for transit and pedestrian preferences. So these are the people who are just gaga for transit and pedestrian neighborhoods in Boston, transit, and in Atlanta, and they have measurably the same preferences. So if you're one of those people and you live in Boston, you've got an 84% chance of living in a neighborhood like that. So in other words, Boston, with its historical pattern that provided lots and lots of walkable neighborhoods, together with lots and lots of auto-oriented neighborhoods, we've got sprawl in Boston as well, gives people the opportunity to get more of what they want. So if you have those preferences, you've got about an 84% chance of getting what you want in Boston. Well, I think you can see where it's headed. You're somebody with the identical preferences, but you have the, shall I say, misfortune of living in Atlanta, you have a less than 50% chance. In other words, there are such neighborhoods in Atlanta. They're rare. They're expensive because they're rare. Why? Because for a generation or two, we've been regulating development in Atlanta to be a single kind of monoculture, auto-oriented suburban. It's a very, very physically homogeneous metropolitan area. It doesn't offer the range of neighborhood types that others do, certainly not that Boston does. So I called this talk Regulatory Obstacles to Complete Communities. Now, if I weren't afraid of raising expectations too high, I might have called it Overcoming Regulatory Obstacles to Complete Communities. But since I kept expectations low, now I can shift and let's think about how can we overcome? What are some of the stories of overcoming, or the ways of thinking about overcoming regulatory obstacles to complete communities? So I'd like to argue that we have 3 levels of policy reform. Going from nothing's easy, by the way. 0 is easy, but let's going from the easiest to the hardest. Let's think about what the families of policy reform might be. My first family of policy reform is education for municipal level action. So education, I don't know about you, whenever I hear education as a policy implication, I consider it a big yawner. Yeah, right, we all need to know better stuff. But there's actually very real stuff going on in education. When municipalities learn from one another, and they look at the town down the road that developed a walkable neighborhood, that developed a complete community, and people learn that, hey, that's actually a pretty nice place. It holds its value. It's not an instant slum. All of these things are a process of education from municipality to municipality, and some people have been saying, and some municipalities have been saying, gosh, we want some of that too. It's an important to understand that a lot of this is happening. I think education is also a generational issue when it comes to the professions, especially the urban planning profession. Recently, I went back and looked at my first textbook in urban and regional planning. It was written in 1977. And I was actually surprised to see the extent to which it presented strict land use separation as the dogma. That is the way to do things. I didn't realize that that's how we were educated back in the 70s and the 80s. I thought we were already pretty progressive, but apparently not. And of course, that's not how urban planning is taught anymore. So as younger generations of urban planners displace older retiring folks, that's another process of education that's going on. To put some flesh on these bones, let's tell a specific story. This is West Village in Dearborn, Michigan. So the story here is that the mayor became interested in developing a walkable neighborhood just adjacent to the downtown of Dearborn, Michigan. Developed a request for proposals that was sent out to the development community. There were several proposals that were submitted. There was a proposal that was accepted, and the development was built. A few lessons in this story. The first lesson is, I used to think that complete communities are what happens when municipalities stop preventing them. I no longer think that. I think that complete communities are what happens when municipalities shift from preventing them to actively promoting them. So the role of those requests for proposals was to signal the development community that it's safe to enter the water, that it's okay. You're not going to lose your shirt. You're not going to get shot down. This is actually what we want. And as a municipality, we've already decided that's what we want. So that's an important message about signaling. Second message is, even when this, in the process of developing West Village in Dearborn, notwithstanding the fact this is what the city had already decided it wanted, the developer needed 52 variances in order to complete this development. So the city used that as an opportunity to examine its code, and they said, well, wait a second. If the developer needs 52 variances, something's wrong with our code. We ought to scour our code, and we ought to make the good easy. And they did. They reformed their zoning code, and the next developer who came in with a similar development required only 2 variances. So that's another lesson, and the lesson is not only do, as municipalities, do we have to want it and actively signal that that's what we want, we have to make sure that nothing in our code is impeding it. Second level of policy reform, changing the incentive structure. So here we're starting to grow some teeth, and here's where a higher level of government is saying to municipal government, you know what, you've got the prerogative to regulate as you will, but we've also got our prerogative, and we've also got our interest. My personal favorite example in this one is in the San Francisco Bay Area with BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit District, and municipalities in the Bay Area generally are very favorably inclined towards BART. Everybody would like to have a BART station. Of course, not everybody can have a BART station. This is a transit village at Pleasant Hill BART in Contra Costa County. BART has a very interesting policy. It says, in ranking municipalities for their priority for BART extension, it considers their land use plans. So here's BART saying to the municipalities, you know what, you can do what you want. You can regulate for low density, you can regulate for single family, you can regulate for land use separation. But if you regulate in a way that's hostile to our interests as a regional transit provider, you're falling down on the priority list. So that's something different than merely education. That's education with a stick behind it. Another fantastic example is right next door in Maryland. I think most people are familiar with Maryland's growth print system, the idea that certain areas are targeted for growth or other areas are not. And the state of Maryland says, we're going to fund lots of infrastructure and schools in areas that are targeted for growth. If you're not in such an area, you're not going to get that kind of. So it's not actually interfering with the prerogative of the local land use regulator, but it's saying, you know what, we're paying for some things and we're not paying for others. The third level, and with this I'm going to wrap up. The third level is the toughest nut to crack. This is the power sharing regionalist level. And so here is where we're empowering a region or a state not to supplant the municipality, but we're empowering a region or the state to share land use authority with the municipality. The closest example we have in the United States is the state of Oregon, and especially Portland Metro, where Portland's metropolitan government, I'm going to choose my words carefully, works cooperatively with municipalities to determine what their fair share of growth is. And of course, growth within the urban growth boundary of metropolitan Portland really means what their fair share of density is, because that's how you grow within the urban growth boundary. So it works cooperatively. And I had an interesting conversation with the head of Portland Metro a couple years ago. And I said, how do you do it? And she said, well, we really work cooperatively. I said, well, what if a municipality would dig in its heels and say, you know what, no more density here. We just don't want it. We're turning it down. Could you force them? And she said sort of two things. One was, oh no, we could never do that, and then we would never do that. So I'm not sure quite where she fell between the could and the would. But I said, well, what would you do? She says, well, we have our tools. I said, okay, now we're getting somewhere. Tell me about those tools. She said, well, if there's a recalcitrant municipality, it's most likely going to be one of the municipalities on the edge, near the urban growth boundary. So I'm going to go to that municipality, I'm going to say, oh, I see that you don't want to accept what we've determined to be your fair share of growth / density. Well, that's too bad, because growth is happening in our region, and the growth really needs to be somewhere. So in order to accommodate our forecast growth, if you're not going to accept it, you know what we need to do? We need to expand our urban growth boundary. Oh, and by the way, want to know where we're going to expand it? Right on your border. And of course, municipalities love to be on the urban growth boundary, not in the middle of the metro area. So she says they find that fairly convincing. So here we have, in U.S. terms, a super empowered regional government that actually has some leverage over municipalities. So this is the toughest nut to crack. But I want to end with something even that goes even beyond. For that, I have to go outside the boundaries of the United States to Ontario, Canada. So Ontario has a very interesting planning structure with a super empowered planning board at the provincial level. It's called the Ontario Municipal Board. The Ontario Municipal Board can and does overrule local zoning decisions, and it fundamentally enforces regional plans. So if you're a municipality in an area zoned for denser growth and you're zoning out the density, that Ontario Municipal Board is going to reverse you on appeal. And they're going to say you have to issue the building permits. So here we have a very, very strong planning body at the provincial level. And I was in a conversation with, I gave a talk like this to the Ontario Home Builders Association, and I was asking them, what do they think about the Ontario Municipal Board? Now, if you ask many of our development community, what would they think about a very, very strong planning board at the state level, I think they would oppose it. I suspect from some you would hear the term socialism, and for others you would hear the term micromanaging, etc. What did the Ontario home builders tell me? We can't imagine doing business without it. That was kind of a jaw-dropping response. We can't imagine doing business without this super empowered planning body at the provincial level. And why is that? They say it's our fundamental tool for overcoming municipal exclusion. So I close with that to illustrate the conundrum of how we think of planning and how we think of markets. And hopefully in these 45 minutes I've shifted a little bit of thinking about what counts as planning, what counts as markets, and why one would want to shift policy for complete communities. Thank you very much.